Hey, it's Christopher Cardinal, and you're listening to the super fantastic. I think it's above average. I'd say you, but I think it's above average. Super fantastic, above average racing, spectacular. And this is a bonus episode. We're deviating from our regular format just a little so we can take a trip back in the way back machine. And on this particular adventure, we're going to party like it's 1999. I am covering the Exide Batteries 400 from Richmond back in September of 1999. And guess what? We don't even need nuclear reaction to generate 1.21 gigawatts of electricity to get there. No, we do not. We are going back to September 11th, Richmond, 1999, minus Great Scott and the gigawatts and all that nonsense. But here we are. We're going to take a little trip down memory lane for you, and we're going to recap Tony Stewart, one of NASCAR's most polarizing drivers, I guess you would call him. Built a great reputation for himself in the open wheel market in USAC and in Indy Racing League, where he would win the Indy Racing League Series title in 1997. So he came into much fanfare before he arrived in NASCAR, where he ran some, I guess, a limited schedule and wasn't highly successful in the Xfinity Series, which was then known as the Busch Grand National. But you get away from that. I think winning in that series or running well in that series necessarily doesn't translate to success at the Cup level. We've seen that from a lot of drivers through the years. Todd Bodine, Jeff, the Green brothers, Jeff and David, both champions in that series. Johnny Benson Jr., who we're going to talk a lot about in this episode, almost ad nauseum. I didn't ever thought when I'd be, taking on this venture that I would be speaking so much about Johnny Benson Jr. But that to me, that's a flip to him. Props to him that we're talking about him all these years later. A talent that I thought really could have went really far in the Cup Series, just different place, different time. Benson Jr. Could have been one of the top stars. They're stars, and then they're superstars, and unfortunately, not everybody quite makes that cut. So for Johnny Benson Jr., didn't quite work out at the Cup level, but as I said later, we'll talk about some of his other ventures he had. And then Jimmy Johnson, I'm going to throw Jimmy Johnson in there too. He didn't quite have the Xfinity Series career that he did in the Cup Series, because when you look at Tony Stewart, he came in from the open wheel ranks, so there was a lot of, I guess, second guessing. Is he going to make that translation into stock cars and becoming a winning stock car driver? And at the time, I think, as you would see years later, different time, different place, there was a plethora of drivers from the open wheel ranks that tried their hand in stock car, never quite really adapted or could make that transition seamlessly. And we had a pretty good, I think at the time, the sample size was fairly large. And you could quantify that saying, well, you had Jacques Villeneuve, Danny Patrick, Hornish Jr., Dario Franchitti, who I think, and I'm being a bit partisan here, is the greatest stock car this greatest open wheel driver of all time. Scott Dixon's gonna make that case pretty hard for me come Sunday when he's going to, I believe, capture his fifth title in that series. Much love for Dixon and Dario Franchitti. I think two of the greatest open wheel drivers to ever get behind the wheel. So Stewart built himself quite the reputation. He had the fanfare coming in. Joe Gibbs hired him, expanded to a second car in 1999 with backing from Home Depot. And he was up in a rookie class, really, where I think at first glance, I expected more out of Elliott Sadler with the Wood brothers to challenge Tony neck and neck for that rookie title. Didn't quite work out for him, unfortunately. Well, as you know, Elliott Sadler went on to have a great career in the Xfinity Series much years later. Had a pretty decent Cup career, too. I think it's just things didn't quite pan out the way they might have hoped for at Robert Yates when he was behind the 38 car and had a, he made the playoffs one year, had won some races in that car. It just never quite translated to the success that I think Elliott was hoping for when he made the move to drive for Robert Yates. Buckshot Jones, remember him? Buckshot Roy Jones, the guy who got that. Some people ask, well, where did someone get a name like Buckshot? The story goes back. His grandfather, and his name is Roy. His actual given name is Roy Jones. His grandfather said he was tougher than a buckshot, and I guess it just stuck with him. And he was the Ricky Stenhouse Jr. before Ricky Stenhouse Jr. Much to the criticism, a guy that liked to wreck race cars, and not intentional, mind you. I don't think Buckshot Jones, when he set out to embark on a stock car career in the Xfinity Series, then known as the Busch Series, was my main objective. You know what, folks? I'm going to, work my life and really work hard to build a career here in the Xfinity and just to wreck race cars. So much to what some Randy LaJoie fans might say, but I thought Buckshot, again, just different place, different time, could have been a really good driver. I think he showed flashes of brilliance. This guy in his first Cup start at Dover in '98, driving for the Stavola brothers, who were pretty much on the way out the door. Sponsorship from Circuit City was falling through. Tough financial times for the Stavolas that they were really running up against the clock there. They just seemed to not have they weren't that successful, that team. When you look back at the Stavola brothers, they didn't quite enjoy the success that a Hendrick did, or a Jack Roush, or Joe Gibbs, but they've had a pretty impressive driver lineup through the years. And at this point, Buckshot Jones would fill in for Hutch Strickland, who was released from the team at the time. And he ran eighth. He ran in the top 10 all day long that day at Dover. He had a hell of a race, made quite the impression on me, and I think others at the time who followed the sport. And it just never quite clicked for Buckshot. He missed. They started off really behind the eight ball. I think he was racing for his family team. His pa was funding the operation out of pocket. They had some sponsorship, I believe, from Aquafresh, the toothpaste company there. And I think they had a little Crown Fiber comes to mind. I think that car was a pretty stellar paint scheme when you look back at it. Silver with some aqua trim was pretty legit. But paints, we don't win races and we don't win Rookie of the Year titles or championships with snazzy paint schemes, unfortunately. But hey, he had probably the coolest paint scheme in that rookie class. And then they had Ed Barrier, the other standout. Had some modest success in the Busch Series, and he was also part of that rookie class of 1999. So essentially, this was Tony Stewart's to lose, was it not? I mean, it was one of those deals where he saw success right out of the gate. And he's on the outside pole of the Daytona 500. Finished 28th in the race. I think a lot of times Daytona is one of those tracks where I'm not going to say that you don't need skill to win. That'd be wrong of me to say that you don't need skill to win a race at any level. Of course you need skill. But Daytona, if you're in the draft, you're in the right place, right time, you can win. I mean, that's part of what restrictor plate racing. That's the epitome of restrictor plate racing, is finding your way in that draft late in the going and just to make that right move, and you're there in the winner's circle, or you could be have your car torn up. It all depends. You got to make the move when you got to do it. So back in this race, I'm not going to give. We're talk more about the actual details of the race when we get started. Um, Tony Stewart did earn career win number one of 49. He would collect 49 wins throughout his illustrious career that wrapped up in 2000 at the conclusion of 2016. He led that race for 333 laps. Quite the superior performance that evening. 8 cars were only left on the lead lap of a 43-car field. If you watch the end of the race, we'll talk a little bit about it once we get to the race portion. We're going to cover news items that were topical at the time, around late August, early of September of 99. And you could see Ted Musgrave, who was the last car on the lead lap in 8th place. Tony was just about to lap him, but the checkers flew and saved Mr. Musgrave from going down another lap, or actually going down a lap and finishing outside of the lead lap. And topic of note, it's a name that we don't talk about much. Another driver, I think, who was able to revitalize his career in the trucks years later, Ted Musgrave. That would be Musgrave's final top 10 finish. He finished 8th that evening. That would be his final top 10 finish of his career. And Xfinity Cup, excuse me, see these series names change so much. I'm not Xfinity Cup. Monster Energy Cup, then known as the Winston Cup. Too many title sponsor changes. Stop changing the title sponsors of these series. My goodness. So that Tony Stewart back then would see success fairly early, as we said. He bounced back from that outside pole and that poor finish at Daytona to get his first career top 10 at Darlington in the spring race. And his first career pole would come at Martinsville in the spring. And then he would also give himself a great top 5 finish at Talladega, would be his first top 5, the 5th place for him. And he backed that up with a 4th at Fontana. And he would have three 4th place finishes. He'd have 3 finishes in the 4 races in that span of excuse me. I'm going to back that up. I'm recording this at a ungodly hour of the day, so just bear with me. I thank you for your patience. So there was 3 4th place finishes in a span of 4 races from Fontana to Dover. Got through that, thank you. So 12 top 10s in those 14 races from Charlotte to Richmond, where he collected his first win. 6 of the 12 top 5s, 6 of those 12 races were top 5 finishes. So Stewart really, despite not setting the Busch Series on fire, found a way to really adjust to Cup racing and made the most of a great opportunity with a great sponsor in Home Depot, and they would win championships together. Not so long, not too many years later down the road either. So Stewart was made to race in this series. I think looking back in 99 at this very time, I thought Tony was going to be a good driver in the Cup Series. I didn't think he'd reach the heights he reached. And I'm just being honest. I'm giving you my honest opinion. It's not one way or the other that I'm a Tony Stewart mark or not. Because honestly, I'll be honest, I'm not a really huge Tony Stewart fan. I respect what he's done on the track. I respect what he's done with Stuart Haas Racing all these years later, taking Gene Haas's team from obscurity to superstardom to an elite status in a series that it's been extremely tough to sustain any kind of stability. Look what we're seeing. Look, the championship team from last year is gone next year. Think about that for a moment. Lowe's, who sponsored Jimmy Johnson since his rookie season 2002, gone. You've had Red Bull Racing try their hand at NASCAR. They're gone. You've had so many sponsors just see themselves to the exit. So many teams see themselves to the exit. Casey Kane is retiring. You've had Dale Jr. leave the sport. Jeff Gordon, Carl Edwards, just the list goes on. And this sport has gone through quite a transition in the past 4 years. And Tony Stewart and Stewart Haas, Gene Haas, they are still clicking on all cylinders. Team looks stout. They have 3 drivers that have won races in 2018. Eric Almirola, all 4 made the playoffs this year. All 4 cars are going to race for the championship for Stewart Haas. That says a lot, not only about Tony, to his business savvy and how much he really believes in the drivers and the equipment that hit the racetrack each and every week. It just says a lot about what he's done for the careers of someone like Clint Boyer, who hadn't won a race in 6 years prior to taking the checker flag this year on 2 occasions. Eric Almirola, a driver that Gibbs Castaway, was racing part-time for DEI at one point in his career, racing for James Finch in an underfunded car, starting and parking. Remember those days of starting and parking? Toughed it out with Richard Petty and Richard Petty Motorsports, and by the grace of God found a way to win with them, albeit rain short in a few years back at Daytona. But look how it's elevated his career. Eric Almirola, I think, is a driver we're going to keep a close eye on once the playoffs commence this coming weekend. So, but enough of that. I'm sidebar. I'm very sorry. I'm sidetracking. I'm just trying to put over Tony Stewart here really well. So he'd follow up the win with 2 runner-up finishes, Loudon and Dover. So they were just clicking. They would find speed. And he started off the season showing a lot of promise in 99, but no one was quite sold, I think. It was just a matter of, it wasn't when he wasn't going to, everyone knew he was going to win a race. It was just a matter of when. I think that's a fair assessment to draw when you're armchair quarterbacking news items and races that are nearly 20 years old. No one for a moment thought this guy was going to go winless. And we'll get back to the comments in a moment. But anyhow, he would end the season with 2 more victories, Phoenix and Homestead. He'd finished 4th in the standings. Extremely impressive for a rookie at the time. And back in those Winston Cup days, the rookies didn't quite have the clout or really had the ability to run up front like the rookies do now. What we see now, like back in the 2000s, mid 2000s, that rookies were challenging for championships. Back then, it was really unheard of. It wasn't something that was commonplace for a rookie to finish 4th in the driver's standings. And had there been a playoff back then, dare I say, Stewart could have been competing for the championship in his rookie year. So this win for Smoke, he was the first rookie to win a race since Davey Allison did in 1987 at Dover. And here's where I go back to where I touched on it in our first episode of our weekly program. You have idiots out there who are just spewing off nonsensical bullshit for fucking whatever reason I don't know. What does that do for you, that you have to type behind a fucking screen how much you loathe someone you don't even fucking know? Think about that for a fucking moment. How delusional can one be that you're going to hate on someone that you have never probably even met, do not know anything about other than what you see on a fucking screen? So before I keep going with that, I had people, there's a racing reference. When I was doing some of my research for this event, and I did watch the race on YouTube. That's the first time I watched this race actually to do my research for this broadcast a couple weeks ago. And it's the first time I saw the race in 19 years. And I just remember the reaction people got in the race when Jeff Gordon. Well, we'll talk about that actually. I think when we cover. We'll save that for when I cover the race. But they were pissed off that Tony won and that he broke Davey Allison's record from 1987 as a rookie to win in the Cup Series. Are you fucking shitting me? Records are meant to be broken, folks. And it's not a knock on Davey Allison. He's not here to defend himself, and God rest his soul. But why would you be angry to see a record broken? And if it wasn't Tony to do it, someone else would have done it. That's what records are for, folks. They're meant to be broken. Why? I see. It really bewilders me how people can get so hung, and especially NASCAR fans, why you get so hung up on guys breaking records or certain people winning certain races or passing somebody on the all-times wins list. You're hearing it now with Kyle Busch, and he's one win away from actually leapfrogging Tony Stewart and winning 50 races. He's tied with him at the moment. But he acknowledges that. Kyle Busch, when he had won his 49th, acknowledged what an honor and privilege it was to be tied on the all-time records list with the likes of a Tony Stewart. So think about that for a moment, folks. If the driver who's actually out there putting in the hard work behind the race car, winning these races, is paying homage to the greats from the past, why are we hating on them? Again, I'm not going to keep bitching about dirt sheet writers or trolls who think they know the answer to the universe. They know all of the pressing questions. They can cure everything. They can just by the flip of a switch, by clicking tweet or clicking like or retweet, whatever. It's just nonsense to me. So anyway, we're going to move on from that, and we're going to go to some news items that were in the news around this time. As you know, as it is you're seeing right now in 2018, they call that silly season. Well, it's just, don't ask why, but it is some silly shit, isn't it? Drivers are just switching teams left and right. And nothing was different back in 1999. You had the same scenario. Drivers didn't stay with teams for very long. Johnny Benson Jr., as we talked about him, as I said, we're going to talk about him ad nauseum. Not that that's a bad thing. So Johnny Benson, if you hear this, much love for you, brother. He was released from his contract at Roush around August 30th. The former Busch Series champion from 95, who enjoyed tremendous success in the American Speed Association and with base motorsports in the Busch Series, joined Roush in the beginning of 1998 with sponsorship of General Mills, as Jack Roush would expand his operation from 3 cars to 5. And he also would have a familiar face and former Grand National standout Chad Little, who also raced for base in his career and enjoyed tremendous success with them in that series as well. So coming off a modest, rookie season with Chuck Ryder, I think Chuck Ryder's team, I think they were called Bahari Racing. I don't quite remember. I think they didn't enjoy a lot of success in the Cup Series. So I think the team's name was Bahari. I'll have to dig back in my notes, but in any case, the owner was Chuck Ryder. And Benson did well in his rookie season. He was outside of the top 10 in the standings. He did tremendously well. Had a great 1997 rookie campaign. So in 98, you think the natural progression is, I'm running with Jack Roush. Top tier equipment in this sport. The wins are going to be flowing like wine. Not necessarily the case here. Benson In 98 would have no wins. He wouldn't win a race. He'd have three top fives and 10 top 10 finishes. And this is where it gets good. This is where I think a lot of times paradigms and paradoxes in sports don't make a lot of sense. He misses Daytona. They didn't have the owner points or enough points to actually make the race on time trial. So he misses the show. He goes home. They pack up. Big name sponsor. You got the big Cheerios on the hood, Betty Crocker on the side panels, General Mills' two most recognizable brands on your car, and you're packing that shit up, and you're going home, man. Deflating feeling. But this team would get their best finish of their existence, not just of the season in 98, but their actual 2-year tenure, their 2-year run would be at Vegas in March of 98. These guys peaked early, dude. When you look at it, they had a lot of potential, but they seemed to have reached their heights out of the gate. You missed Daytona. You just scribble that away. Let's erase Daytona. And you've got fourth at Vegas? But I think that was the year. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'll have to go back in my notes. I think that's the year, the first Vegas race, they were all in the top 5. They were 4 out of, I think, Chad Little might have finished in the top 10. And I believe Musgrave, Benson, Martin, and Burton made up 4 out of the top 5. I'll have to double check on that. Actually, for all intents and purposes, let's do that right now. I'm going to just throw it in my old Google machine here. Vegas from 1998 or 1990. Yes, 1998. That was the very first race at Las Vegas. I'm going to fire it up just real quickly in the Google machine here, dial up racing reference and see if I'm indeed correct. But anyway, before we do that, we'll give that a few moments here. He'd go on quite a bit of a hot streak as he would finish 9th at Atlanta, 8th at Darlington, 5th at Bristol, 5th at Texas. So in a 10 starts, 10th race into the season, he was 10. Excuse me, I said that wrong. He was 10th in the standings after 7 races in 98. And that's after missing Daytona. That's after you're not racing the 500. You're not in the race and you're house of fire. You are on fire. Okay, here we are. Correction. I stand to be corrected. I have the rundown from the race in Vegas. So it was Burton and Martin. Martin first, Burton second. Benson was 4th. Musgrave 6th. Little was 10th. So all 5 of the cars were in the top 10. 3 of the 5 were in the top 5. So there we go. I made a mistake. I do apologize. I was stand corrected. He wouldn't finish higher than 8 all season long after that, after the Fontana race in race number 10. So there's so much potential. I just don't know if that's driver. And I never like to accuse a driver that anything that goes wrong on the racetrack or if you're not progressing. I don't like to say that's the driver's issues. It's not. I think Roush at that point was in the championship battle with Burton and Martin. And we'll just touch on it briefly. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time. We could do that at another episode. I think why, if you look back at why Johnny Benson or Chad Little were not successful despite running top-tier equipment for Roush, is the fact is they were in the stable. Because back then you could run 5 cars. And I never agreed with running more than 2 to 3 cars. I think when you start to run multiple cars, you're always going to have 2 of those, maybe 4 or 5, that are going to perform extremely well. And all the resources, all the efforts put into those 2 teams. And I could be wrong. I'm not a team owner. I've never owned a team. I've never driven one of these race cars. I wasn't there. This is me armchair quarterbacking. This is me freestyling on what I see as a racing enthusiast, as someone who's followed this sport for 20 plus years. I'm a smart mark. I know the ins and outs of this. They're not going to tell you this, but I am not going to go on a screen and berate somebody. But in any case, I just think that Little and Benson and Musgrave to a degree were satellite teams to the big two. They maybe shared some of the same setups, some of the same notes, even tried maybe some of the same setups at different times through the year, but different setups work out better for different drivers depending on the track, depending on what the driver was comfortable with. For whatever reason was the case, things didn't work out with Benson and Roush, and he was let go of his contract in 99. And in 99, he only had two top tens. So he had came off a weaker, after having a pretty mediocre 98. His 99 would just be the drizzling shits. And he had a pair of sevens at Dover and the fall race at Loudon. So Roush, in his time with them, in that short tenure with Roush to 2 years, he went through 4 crew chiefs. That's never a good sign. You're going through 4 crew chiefs in 2 years. Again, just I never made business decisions, or I didn't fund a team, so I don't know. But to me, that's just, you can't build a chemistry. Look at some of the chemistry we had through the years: Ravenham, Gordon, Johnson, Knaus, Petrie, Earnhardt. To some degree, Zipadelli, Stewart, who we'll talk about in this episode a lot. This is essentially a Tony Stewart episode. He starts off with Steve Meal, who, a highly respected crew chief, has worked really well. He was a great crew chief in the 80s and into the 90s. But at that point, it wasn't Steve Meal. He would go on to have great success later at DEI in the management side of things for them. And then you'd have Ben Leslie, who was crew chief forever for Roush Fenway at the time, would work with Mark Martin at some point in his career. Pat Trison, and then Tommy Morgan would be his crew chief toward the end of his run here. I sorry, folks, I don't know who Tommy Morgan is. I said I am a racing enthusiast, but until doing my research for this broadcast, do not know Mr. Morgan. I do apologize if I don't know who you are. It's not a name I'm familiar with. Sorry. So he was 28th in the standings that year. As we said, the 95 Grand National champion with base would be released from the contract, and here's where it gets interesting. He is linked to a lot of good rides around this time. His name was popping up everywhere. He was linked to MB2, which ironically he would drive for the year after, but he would start the year there. More on that in a moment. So Benson had even been at this point linked to driving for Robert Yates and being the successor to Kenny Irwin Jr., who had, for whatever reason or another, Yates pulled the plug on just 1 year after his rookie campaign. He would not retain him for 2000. So he was linked to the 28 Texaco team. And we know what that did for Ricky Rudd's career, which we'll touch on in a moment, as Ricky Rudd is also a very topical guy at this time as well. Eventually, Benson would take a ride with Tyler Jett Motorsports, which was the old incarnation of ISM, the Tabasco Fiasco team from the IndyCar series that Todd Bodine ran for, and Darrell Waltrip's team. Darrell Waltrip's Motorsports, which he sold off to this investor, Tim Beverly, this businessman from Texas, shortly after some of his struggles in 1998. So essentially, this was the old incarnation of those two teams, would later be go on to be known as Tyler Jett Motorsports. Just think for a moment, if Benson would have ended up in the car for Robert Yates, the Texaco 28 team, as a teammate to Dale Jarrett, who would win the series championship in 99 and enjoy great success in the late 90s into the early 2000s. Where could have Benson's career gone? We could be talking about Johnny Benson Jr. winning 5 to 10 races in that span, competing for titles. But for whatever reason or another, it didn't happen. He didn't end up there. So we're not going to focus too much about that. He would actually finish 13th in the standings in 2000. So he had a bit of a bounce back year, big time bounce back year. He would be 11th in 2001. and would fade a bit in 2002, despite winning his first Cup event at Rockingham in the fall. So he would have go on to taste victory in the Cup Series. Good for him, because I think if he went down as one, you know, talk about guys that go their whole careers without winning: Kenny Wallace, Jeff Green, Todd Bodine, Randy LaJoy. A lot of the peers that were competing, Chad Little, with Benson at that time. So for Benson to score a Cup win, bravo. Good for him. I think it's great that he was a winner in the series. Deservedly so. I think Johnny Benson Jr., I think different place, different time, could have been one of the greats in the sport, and he would go on to have a career resurgence, a career renaissance with Bill Davis and the Truck Series. We finished second in the standings in 06, third in 07, and actually win the series championship in 08. So we made the best out of unsatisfactory situations. Didn't stick in the Cup. I think we would run a handful of Cup races shortly after 2002, but that would be his last time we would see him. So just 3 short years later, he's out of the picture in the Cup Series completely. He would claim 14 wins in the Truck Series in 3 years with Bill Davis, so that's impressive. And he would just sort of fade off into the sunset not long after his time in the Truck Series. However, it's just a great story for a guy that I think, again, could have been a big name in the sport, but just for whatever reason didn't catch the right breaks and just never materialized for him, unfortunately. So at the time also, interestingly enough, Base Motorsports, his Xfinity Series team, was discussing moving their efforts to the Cup Series with Benson. So they had that familiarity. They were running together for a championship just a handful of years before this in 1995. And that was a highly successful organization in the Grand National Series, as they would win the title in 95 with Benson and repeat with LaJoy in 96 and 97. Eventually, they would move to the Cup Series in 2002 with Tony Raines. Actually, no, they would in 2002. They did a handful of races with Chad Little and a couple other drivers, and Raines in 03 would go full time with really no success. And I think Base just sort of was phased out of the sport not long after. So it was reported on September 2nd that Benson and Base were discussing potential opportunities in the Cup Series to move up together. Just relied heavily on sponsorship, like mostly any transaction between driver and team relies heavily on sponsorship dollars, even back in 1999. And Benson, who knows what it could have became of that had they had the right sponsor. But I think, again, they would have been chasing their tail. It just seemed like a lot of times technical alliances are what helps a lot of these smaller teams. And I'm not sure Base would have had the resources to really capitalize on that. So September 6th of that year, of 99, That's Racing, a publication, reported that Benson was one of 3 drivers linked to the 36 car with MB2, along with Todd Bodine and Wally Dullenbach. And Tyler Jett was also a candidate. Were extremely high on Benson after they mutually parted ways with their driver, Rich Bickle, shortly after Darlington, citing team chemistry. I think it was a mutual decision and this Tyler Jett team, as we're going to discuss here in a few moments, was one of the biggest clusterfucks in NASCAR history. So for Benson to even bring that team to relevancy as he did in 2000, I thought, just all the power to you, brother. That is amazing, because this team was just complete. I don't know if the equipment was just complete garbage or the owner. Like I said, I'm not here to bury anyone. I don't have a shovel. I don't want to bury Tim Beverly. I hear so much rumor and innuendo about him on the internet through the years, and many lawsuits he's had, and we'll touch on a few of those in a moment. But to take garbage equipment and you're running up front late in the day, having a chance to not only run up front, but have a chance to win the Daytona 500 just a short year later. Wow, that's just Man, shit can change on a dime, can it? Um, so ironically enough, he was linked to that 36 car even in late 99, and he would wind up racing for MB2 the next season. Jeff Purvis was also linked at the time of Bickle's. We're talking about Tyler Jett here. Jeff Purvis, tremendous standout from the Busch Series at the time, was linked to Tyler Jett, but apparently turned down the opportunity, wanted no part of this. Maybe he saw the writing on the wall, or he was he had a fortune teller or a psychic tell him, "You don't want to do this. This is career suicide. Do not race. I repeat, do not sign with Tyler Jett Motorsports." Oh my, listen to you, eh? Robbie Gordon and Randy LaJoie also were names that were on the list for Tyler Jett. They also said, no, thank you. Jack Sprague would attempt Richmond. Jack Sprague, the truck champion, and very, to me, let's talk about him for a minute. I don't know if we're going to talk about him very much on this program, but Ron Hornaday and Jack Sprague's rivalry in the late 90s for that truck title, wasn't that some of the most interesting point battles in NASCAR history? Is it not? Unsung heroes. So he'd failed to make the race at Richmond. He wouldn't race in that car again, as on September the 8th, it was also announced that the team sponsor, Lucky Dog, that's a fun name, isn't it? Lucky Dog. Well, they certainly weren't Lucky Dogs. 10-10-345. This is some dated shit. We're talking about these. I guess it was a big thing back in the 90s. These 1-800 collect or 10-10-345. These numbers you could phone where you could get a reduction on your long distance calls or what have you. Now that just seems like a memory of days gone by, right? But anyhow, they announced that they weren't going to return in 2000, despite signing a 3-year deal back in 1998. So that would have carried them through 2000. So they decided, you know what? I'm bailing too. Looks like this team is headed for the shitter. So I'm jumping off the ship while it's still afloat, but not quite submerged just yet. Well, wouldn't take long. So at that time, it was also reported that this team's future really relied on it was in the sponsor's hands, and Johnny Benson and Ted Musgrave were two top candidates to take over the seat of the car for 2000, which Benson ultimately wind up signing with them in November of that year. But it relied heavily on sponsors. They went in unsponsored. So some of these reports, as I said, at times can be conflicting, and you just got to wonder really what is legit and what's not. But then again, that's that whole back to rumor and innuendo, and how much of this do you want to believe from dirt sheets or internet rumors? Don't take too much credence in what you hear. Please do not. David Green would actually finish out the year in the car for 99, and he did, I think, fairly well. He recorded his best career finish in Cup of 12th at Phoenix, and he would even win the pole at Homestead that year. But he was not retained for 2000. He was sent packing. That's the unfortunate story here, too, with David Green. I thought David Green, given, again, the right opportunity. I know he became a test driver for Hendrick and got to run a few races for Hendrick years later, but man, I thought he had a lot of talent in the Xfinity Series, and I thought he could have been a big name in Cup, but just for whatever reason or another, different place, different time, folks. So owner Tim Beverly, we talked about it, went through a lot of legal issues in the years to follow. Lycos came on board as a sponsor shortly after their impressive Daytona showing where they nearly won the 500 with a non-sponsored car, but they would just pull their sponsorship due to lack of payment. Or was cited that Lycos was pulling due to unpaid bills in July of 2001. July of 2000. and the team was sold to MB2 in July of 2000, just after Daytona. And Johnny Benson would wind up racing for them and would get sponsorship from Aaron's, and go on to do fairly well. And I believe he was in the 36 car with Valvoline sponsorship not long after they left Mark Martin and Roush Racing. So back to attention. We're going to turn our attention now to Red a bit. So I'm just thinking back to just one more thing off the can about Johnny Benson. We'll stop talking about Johnny Benson Jr., I promise. Ricky Rowe would eventually end up in the 28 car. He would shut down his team. He had some issues where he couldn't quite get sponsorship to keep going anymore. He was one of the rare driver owners at the time. That's totally dead now. Well, it had a resurgence in late 2000s with Tony Stewart, but we'll get into that later. Tony Stewart is not your normal owner driver. He's just it's in a whole other league, that fella. But anyway, so from 2000 to 2002, Rudd wins 3 races for these guys. He would win. He would have 34 top 5 finishes, 53 top 10s, 3 poles. Would finish 5th in the standings in 2000, 4th in 01, and regressed a bit, 10th in 2002. So just look at those numbers, how much on the back end Ricky Rudd's career was in 98 and 99, where he was just fighting to survive every week. And he had that heroic performance at Martinsville of 98, which we are covering as a bonus episode in a couple weeks. So don't forget to click in for that one, because that is a pretty incredible story 20 years later to keep a win streak alive. That would end a year later, but as we said, he didn't have the crystal ball to tell him that, hey, all that was for nothing. A year later, this is over. But in any case, it was still pretty awesome, pretty impressive. I dig Ricky Rudd. I dig what he was doing. And just to think those numbers, those are great numbers. That could have been Johnny Benson Jr.'s numbers had he not taken this Tim Beverly, Tyler Jett. It's a clusterfuck anyway, so who really cares? This terrible 45 team, had he not taken on that role, really did some damage, I think, in that 28 Texaco car. He would look pretty snazzy in that black and red getup as well. So let's go back to Ricky Rudd now. He was in search of sponsorships that at this time was wanting to keep his streak alive, and he got food poisoning during this weekend at Richmond. I don't know what he got a hold of, a bad taco or what, but he would sit out of the car for qualifying as Dick Trickle would be in the car and qualified the car for him, and we would leave him actually in the race as he would step out of the car. And we'll talk about that a little bit when we cover the actual race. But he would step out. Dick Trickle would qualify the car at Richmond. So Rudd was aiming to keep that consecutive Ironman streak alive, 564 consecutive streak starts. By that standard, that was a hell of an impressive Ironman streak. So he'd go on to have 788 career consecutive starts before that would end, when he would step away from racing in 2006, and he would make a triumphant return to Yates and for 31 races in 07. And Rudd is second on the all-time Ironman list at 788, as those starts would range from January 11th, 81 until November 20th of 05. And first on that list is Jeff Gordon at 797, where he had his career ran from November 15, 92 to November 22nd of 15. And the current Ironman we have today, we have Mr. Jimmy Johnson and Ryan Newman, who are at 602 consecutive starts. Good for them. And that streak started on February 17th of 02. And Yates would still would sign with the 28 team shortly toward the end of the 1999 season. As he said, he was trying to secure sponsorship from Georgia Pacific, Dell, to keep his team going, the number 10 car, into the new millennium. And there was a lot of interest in others wanting to purchase his team. AJ Foyt emerged as a candidate, as AJ Foyt was going to return, drop his name back into the ring in cup racing. And Tide bolted, longtime sponsor Tide detergent, Procter & Gamble owned company, would go to Cal Wells. Cal Wells, the IndyCar um, owner, kart Champ Car, was operating a cup team in 2000, where you'd actually select Scott Pruitt as his driver, and that'd be a two-car team at one point when Andy Houston would race for them. From big, and that they attracted big name sponsors too, and as you know, Cal Wells' team would be most infamous for Ricky Rudd's stellar finish at the Southern 500. Excuse me, actually at the Trans South Financial 400, I believe that race was called. That was the spring race at Darlington. But anyhow, we're again we're getting off the tracks here. Let's not take a pit stop and talk about some of the stuff that's not relevant. But that would be Cal Wells' achievement moment, crowning moment in Cup racing. So as I mentioned, AJ Foyt was interested in actually purchasing the 10 team, and but he was just growing impatient. Apparently, from what the reports would say, that Rudd was waiting on sponsorship, and so AJ said, "You know what? You keep waiting. You keep figuring out what you're doing. I'm going to start my own team without you. See you later." So Rudd ended up getting rid of the team. He went on to race for Yates and was highly successful, as we documented. So now let's move on to another driver that was quite topical and had Yates connections himself. So we're talking a lot about Robert Yates here in this program. And Ernie Irvan announced his retirement at Darlington just a week before Richmond. MB2 and Irvan made the announcement at a press conference that effective immediately he would be retiring from active competition. He suffered a practice crash injury at a Busch Series race. It actually wasn't the race; it was the practice. The Saturday of Michigan, which was just 2 weeks prior to his announcement at Darlington, where he would almost wreck in the exact same spot he wrecked 4 years earlier in 1994. And that wreck almost claimed his life, and he had a long road to recovery. So he made a comeback in the fall of 95 and ran 3 races for Yates in 95, and would actually go on to win 3 races in 96 and 97 collectively. However, it just wasn't the same. Ernie Irvan didn't quite recover, I think, from those injuries. And 5 years later, after that fatal accident, he would announce his retirement from driving, citing prevention of future incidents as of this, and it just never quite could regain this, I guess, the performance or the whatever the case was. I don't know. I didn't really follow Ernie Irvan too well. He was on the back end when I started to really when I was at the height of my NASCAR fandom from about 97 to 2002. He was on his way out. So I got to see just a little taste of a small sample size of Ernie Irvan and his driving talents. So Dick Trickle would drive the car in Michigan. He was the super sub that year, was he not? Jerry Nadeau would drive the car for the rest of the year in 1999, as he would be moving on to Hendrick, the 25 car in 2000. And Ken Schrader would take over MB2, the seat of the MB2 car for the 2000 season. And again, there was some interesting circumstances surrounding Ken Schrader's deal at the time, where he had signed an extension with Andy Petrie, and there was some controversy around sponsorship woes with Oakwood Homes having some kind of financial difficulties, who was set to sponsor the team into 2000. That never worked out, and Skoal would be leaving the sport. The Skoal Bandits paint scheme, the famous 33, who had agreed to continue with the team despite reports that they would not. Schrader just upped and left and went to MB2. So I'm not sure exactly what happened on the back end with Petrie and Schrader, and they were quite successful at that point. I thought that was one of the best driver combinations from about 97 to 99. They were had modest success. They weren't really challenging for wins or whatnot, but they had it was a great visual, was it not? the Skull Bandit car. That is some legit paint schemes right there, and they're so cool. So Kenny Irwin at the same time, as we said, was uh, dumped by Yates. He would sign on with Felix Sabates, Sabco Racing, and that he would drive the Bell South car that would be vacated by Joe Nemechek, who would find himself uh, behind the wheel of the 33 in 2000 for Andy Petrie. So in 17 starts for the team in 2000 for Kenny Irwin, he would collect no victories, one top 5, one top 10, and his 4th place at Talladega Spring Race would be his only really shining moment for that team. As this is always tough to talk about when we do programs like this, or we go back and look at some of the great drivers from the past, and Irwin would lose his life in July of 2000 at New Hampshire, just 2 months after Adam Petty had died in a practice crash in the Busch Series as well. And I just think that we're not sure what he could have had, what could he have done in his career. I think Kenny Irwin was one of those drivers that I just didn't think Yates gave him a long enough leash and time to really flourish in the car, as he had shown flashes of brilliance in the 28, in the 98 season, and in the 99. And for whatever reason in sports sometime, I think whether it be coaches or players, that a lot of times we're just not patient enough to see how things work out, where everybody just wants instant oatmeal and they want results right away. And we never got to see how good Kenny Irwin Jr. would be in the right circumstances. And I think even with Felix Sabates, even though they're having an off year in 2000, had he been able to drive that car for a few more years, Kenny, we could have been talking about him as one of the major stars in the sport. And who could forget at Daytona in October of 98, how well he ran, nearly won the race. That was the Pepsi 400 that was running the lights that year. So in 87 career cup starts, Irwin had no wins, four top 5s, 12 top 10s, and 3 poles. And his best finish in his career would be 3rd at Daytona in 1999, the Daytona 500, in his 2 years with Yates in 98 and 99. So now let's shift gears here. That was some of the news items that were making headlines back in late August and early September of 1999. So that was silly season was in full swing, and everybody was getting their deals in place for the new millennium. So now we're at the race, the Exide Batteries Select 400. Race 25 of 34 of the 1999 season, and we were coming at you on Saturday, September 11th, 1999. Tomorrow, if you're hearing this, as this episode is being recorded on Monday morning, this episode will drop on Tuesday, as you're listening to this, Tuesday, September 11th, the 19th anniversary of that race and Tony Stewart's first career win. So before we continue, I just want to, as you know, we're coming up on the anniversary of September 11th as we're doing this broadcast, and this race was on that day, 19 years ago. I just think tomorrow or today, whenever you're listening to this, have an opportunity to take a moment to remember the brave servicemen and women out there, the New York City Police Department, the New York City Fire Department, who were courageous on that day of tragedy to give it their all. And 17 years later, I think their contributions to the fabric of America and how resilient the country was during that time, and to see where we are today. As I know things in our society are at times can be unexplainable. We don't know why things transpire the way they do, and we don't have all the answers. And I think when you look at the way you live your life. I think you just got to be honest, and you got to be kind and responsible. And I think you got to love one another. And I think it's days like that where you really reflect and realize that how fortunate you are to have freedom and to live in one of the greatest countries in North America, although this podcast is being recorded in Canada. However, I have a lot of respect for those who will answer the call of duty for America and all of North America, especially in the good old US of A. And God bless America forever. I think we often forget about, we like to forget about days like this. They were tragic and extremely painful for those involved to live through. But I think just you got to give a lot of credit to those who sacrificed and who made the ultimate sacrifice to help America heal during their times of trials and tribulations in the fall of 2001. So now back to the race. The attendance that day was listed at 100,000, but throughout the evening, ESPN's crew would paper the numbers and say it was at 104. There'd be 13 lead changes for 5 different drivers, 6 cautions for 45 laps, and the time of the race was 2 hours, 53 minutes, and 4 seconds. The race opens up with a video package outlining the 1999 battle for the title as Mark Martin was neck and neck with Dale Jarrett, and showing, as I said, I watched this race for the first time in nearly 19 years a couple weeks ago to prepare for this recording. And I also want to just send a shout out. I don't know if they're listening or I'll send them a link or a message on YouTube. But thanks to the Old School Racing Network for posting the content. It was easy to find this race. Fortunately, as we go into the archives, it gets really hard to find some of this information and some of the video footage. As I said, we're going on almost 2 decades ago for this race. And also a big shout out to J-Ski and their archives. That was extremely helpful in my research preparing for this broadcast. J-Ski is a wonderful resource for NASCAR news, and been a huge mark of theirs for a long time. So J-Ski, you are legit. So the race, as I said, opens up with the graphic, and the Dr. Jerry Punch is on pit road previewing up the race. Dale Jarrett's and he had this really crazy opening monologue. It's so Shakespearean-esque, so poetic that I'm actually going to recite some of it here. Jerry Punch is just showing some highlights of Dale Jarrett running into some issues. And otherwise, it was a fantastic season for him prior to this race. I think he says he's calling Dale Jarrett's season a Cinderella season. If he wasn't winning or scoring top fives until the clock struck midnight at Bristol and Darlington. A rain shower tightened up the points. Jarrett's lead over Mark Martin was once over 300 points. The Dale Jarrett's saga of 2 tales of the season. So pretty theatrical stuff when you look at it, is it not? I mean, it's silly shit, look back at it. Dr. Jerry Punch, I think, is one of those underrated reporters in NASCAR. I remember he got a lot of attention and notoriety a few years back when Kurt Busch chewed his ear off and led to his exit at Penske. Who could forget that in December of 2011? But I think it's a great way to open up a race. It's building drama because at the time there is no, picture this, there's no playoffs. There's no tight battle where you have to win races and the points are separated merely by 30 apiece or whatever between 2 drivers. This is a time when I look back at it now, some 20 years later, almost 20 years later, this championship battle wasn't close at all. Dale Jarrett had this thing won, all but won officially. But they were building up that drama like anything can happen. Please watch this race because Mark Martin could have a stellar evening and tighten up that point race. Because I said it was over 300 points. and it had been reduced at that time prior to the start of this race. So he had some issues at the 2 races prior to this, and he says, "Well, you know what happened." And this is Jerry Punch going on again. You know what happened. Snow White couldn't be happier with her 7 dwarfs. Lassie and Timmy were the best of friends, and DJ and his band of merry men once had a 300-point lead in the standings. Well, you know what happened. You got it. Snow White took a bite of the poison apple. Lassie got lost, and DJ had a spin back-to-back weekends at Bristol and Darlington. You follow me here? Follow this fairy tale scenario. We should be looking for a happy ending, right? Remember, the handsome prince kissed Snow White. Lassie found his way home, and oh man! And Dale Jarrett returns to a track where he's won one of his favorite racetracks, where he has won, I believe, I don't know, 3 times in the last 5 starts. I believe that was. But maybe, just maybe, he has a flawless night, and he picks up his 3rd win in the last 5 races. So that was what he said. Excuse me, I got off there. And all makes perfect sense until you remember the ending at the. And this is where this gets so silly. But Dr. Jerry Punch, God love him. He's one of the longtime pit reporters in NASCAR, a benchmark in the sport, and he was entertaining if nothing else, right? And if it all makes perfect sense until you remember the ending of the movie Old Yeller. Now I'm worried again. So here he is trying to set up that Dale Jarrett could have a phenomenal night. He had a good night, mind you, this race. He wasn't in contention to ever win. I think at the end of the post-race interview, he said something along the lines of, "We didn't quite have a car to compete with Tony." All the same, typical banter a driver would tell you when they don't have the perfect night, that, we had a good enough car. We had a very fast car, but we just weren't quite there. Anyway, you've heard it all before. Yeah, that was pretty awesome stuff. I mean, they were trying to build up as if this was a heavyweight championship bout between 2 boxers, 2 UFC fighters. This was Hogan and Andre, And it really wasn't. I think Mark Martin was not really in any contention to win this championship. Dale Jarrett had a large enough lead, I believe, to find himself sitting pretty when this was all said and done. But then again, I'm going to say Jerry Punch was one of the best in the business, and he set the stage really well for this race. Let's just put it that way. Then Bill Weber, remember this guy? He was, I think he was doing the play-by-play for NBC in the mid to late 2000s when NBC covered NASCAR for their summer series. And I heard this dude got fired. I'm not going to talk about much about him or speak negatively of any, but I heard some in the rumor and innuendo mill that this dude got fired for some kind of altercation he had in a hotel or whatnot by NBC. That's why we had never seen him in a racing telecast since then. I wasn't a huge fan of this guy. I thought he was obnoxious on screen. Just wasn't a fan of the guy. So let's just leave it at that. So there was a video package that Mr. Weber is narrating for us that Burton is looking for his 5th win of 1999. He's a $2 million man. He's won the $1 million, the Noble Winston, as it was known back in the day. Just really putting over Burton that he's a legit championship contender as well, despite being fairly well behind Dale Jarrett at this point. But it also is just building up that at the time Jeff Burton was extremely capable at Richmond. He was a great driver at Richmond in this time frame, dominating races. And Jeff Burton, honestly, we're gonna do a lot of Jeff Burton episodes in this program, and that guy is one Roll Tide driver. And Jeff Burton, if you're listening, much respect for you, brother. the broadcaster, so the coverage at this time at ESPN had Benny Parsons, Hall of Famer, Ned Jarrett, Hall of Famer, former champions, and Bob Jenkins, a guy that still, I believe, is somewhat involved in broadcasting races. I think he might do the IndyCar series now, or was doing the IndyCar series up to a couple years ago. He did a phenomenal job on commentary during this race. So Dale Jarrett has a 168-point lead over Martin. As I said, the clock struck midnight, and DJ's pumpkin turned into, I don't know, it transformed into, I can't come up with a clever reference, but anyhow, you get where I'm going with this. He's coming undone a little here. And also Mr. Jenkins would comment here that 4 of the top 10 are separated by only 30 points or less. So it's kind of a tight battle in the points between the drivers not actually contending for the championship. But inside the top 10, there's some pretty tight battles going on. So that's always good. Even today, when you see the playoffs and how they score points now, that it is kind of unique that just because we're not competing for the championship, let's say 2 drivers, positioning is everything. History books and records, where do you want to finish? 3rd or 6th? I'll take 3rd every day, all day. How about you? So Mike Skinner would win his 4th career pole and 2nd of 1999. As the graphic would open, they're showing the starting grid. Tony Stewart was on the front row for the 5th time this year, as it was alluded to by the broadcasters. And they would also mention that Skinner led 67 laps in the May race at Richmond. So they're trying to build up Skinner here. And we all know Mike Skinner. He came from the truck series, was the truck champion in 95. Raced for RCR, was the 97 Rookie of the Year. Won the races in Japan, those exhibition races, but never won a cup race for points. And I feel like he was always one of those guys, looking back at this now and just reflecting on Mike Skinner. It's really sad he didn't win a race. I thought he's one of those guys that could have been, again, much like those Xfinity drivers we talked about in the program, just could never translate the success in the lower tier series to the cup level. And if you look at all 3 of the there's about 3 or 4 big names, I would say, from the truck series era in the inception of the series. So you'd have Ron Hornaday, Jack Sprague, Mike Skinner. You could throw Mike Bliss in there too. For whatever reason or another, those 4 guys, I think Skinner to me was the most successful of the 4 I just named. They never found success in the Cup Series. All failed attempts, never quite really could just translate the success they had. And all of them were champions too. Mike Bliss would go on to win truck title not long after this race. But for whatever reason or another, it just never worked for Mike Skinner, even with RCR. And I think RCR was in a position where for a long time it was Dale Earnhardt Sr.'s team. Adding the second car, I thought was, and on paper looked like a great idea, but I think RCR's historically has been one of those organizations where they have the one car that, as we talked about with Roush, the one car, it's a premier car that can actually carry the banner for the organization, compete for titles, and you have the supporting cast. But like in the movies, right? Every great, or television series, every great actor or actress needs a great supporting cast. I guess in NASCAR too, every great driver needs a great supporting cast around him. Mike Skinner would be the best supporting driver, is he not? So Stewart and Skinner would trade lead for a few laps of the opening laps of the race. Tony Stewart's looking pretty good there as he pulls alongside him. Stewart lead from lap 5 to 29, so 25 laps there up front. And this was the 11th race Stewart has led in his rookie season, as our ESPN broadcast crew would point out. And I think what the broadcast crew was doing a lot here, and I think we're going to talk about it towards the middle of this event, was they made a lot of comparisons to Jeff Gordon and Tony Stewart, as if we knew that at the time no one had really caught the attention of the media or the fan base in a rookie season to that point until Tony Stewart. Jeff Gordon was the last really blue chip rookie, if you will. So Stewart was being painted here, painted that picture that this is a once in a lifetime talent, and which he turned out to be. But there was just so much comparisons and back and forth to him being, again, and I'll use the term loosely, the next Jeff Gordon. So Jenkins, I said, commented on the 97 Rookie of the Year battle. The 97 of the... Man, I just got to take a breather here. Jenkins comments on Skinner, the 97 Rookie of the Year, battling what will be eventually the 1999 Rookie of the Year. So apparently the rookie battle was dead after 25 races. Poor Elliott Sadler. No one thought you had a chance, Elliott. But let's be real. That was lopsided. One of the worst Rookie of the Year battles in NASCAR history. So Dale Jr. was in this race. This was his, he was the fastest car in final practice. So he made his fourth appearance in the Cup Series in 1999. He qualified 21st, and he was working his way up to 17th. And in his first 4 laps out on the track after qualifying, I believe he qualified toward the back of the field. And then there was the battle between Skinner, battle with Bobby Labonte and Gordon. These guys would go on for quite a while, battling for second, third, and fourth. And then behind them was Kenny Wallace and Jeff Burton. It was nice to see Kenny Wallace run up front. And I know we're not going to probably talk a lot to a great extent about Kenny Wallace on this program at any time. Another really underrated guy. I thought that right place, right time, given the great opportunity, could have really found his footing and knocked off a bunch of races. But for whatever reason, Kenny just couldn't quite make that transition as well, and he just would find himself on the back end of a lot of unsatisfactory deals. And Parsons was commenting here on Wallace battling up front, and he even said a good run for him, and good for Benny. Benny was one of those, I think, when I was looking back at this broadcast, I think Benny really brought a lot of character to this ESPN color team, where Jenkins was, I think, highly focused on the championship battle and really bringing that level of adrenaline and enthusiasm to the broadcast. Like, you just gotta watch this race, much like Rick Allen. And I think Rick Allen now in today's NASCAR broadcast in 2018 for NBC, I've never seen a broadcaster in all my years of watching the sport make every restart sound like it's the most exciting fucking thing on the fucking planet. Like, this is it. This is the restart. Green flag flies in the air. He is like so animated. He gives so much credibility to the NBC broadcast. So Rick Allen, I do enjoy your work, and you are a tremendous broadcaster, sir. Jeff Gordon and Skinner battling for second, and they would fall off the pace, man. Like, these guys would be put behind by almost half a car length here. And Stewart was just pulling away, man. So Labonte would be battling back and forth. He would take the second. He'd battle for second place, take the lead for 3 laps on Stewart. And I think Benny and Ned were alluding to the fact that he gave him the 5 bonus points toward the championship. So Tony and Bobby were teammates at the time. He said, here, take your 5 points. I'll just take the lead back. You're welcome, sir. Tony regains the lead on lap 33 to 170, 138 total laps there. So this was Dale Jr.'s 4th race of 1999. This would be his best finish of the year, as he would score a top 10. And he ran extremely well on this race, I think. He did a tremendous job inside the top 10 here this night. So it was his best finish of the 4 of the 5 races he ran that year. As you know, he would go on to compete for Rookie of the Year in 2000. And he's just had a good night. I thought he got a lot of race coverage from the team, as naturally, he would, as well. We know what would become of Dale Jr. later in his career, it made a lot of sense that he got a lot of attention, and this broadcast team would tip him the cap quite a bit that night. So good for them. So after through the first 50 laps, 12 laps, 12 drivers got put a lap down through the first 50 laps. So that's the thing with short track racing. You can catch lap traffic pretty quickly. And I think some of these short track races from back in the day were at times really tough to watch, because if a driver had a great car, he could just blister through a field and just put these guys down laps, and it's just supposed to be painful to watch. Jeremy Mayfield, who was having a bit of a down year in 99 after his breakout year in 98, Rick Mast and him would have some tire wear issues within the first 50 laps, and they would comment, the broadcast team would comment that Mayfield was coming off one of his best finishes at Darlington, and now he's having some issues with the tires. And Rick Mast, I know we don't talk a lot about Rick Mast. I think he's one of those really classic drivers that I don't know if we have a Rick Mast. Anyone can compare to Rick Mast in like today's Monster Energy Cup Series. I think Clint Boyer would come the closest to that, and Rick Mast, I think, was just one of those good old boys from a bygone era that he really enjoyed racing, and there was nothing flashy about this individual. He was just a good old boy from the backwoods that drive the hell out of a race car. So at this time, Rick Mast was the only driver through the first 24 races without a DNF. And he was racing for Cale Yarborough at the time, and a team that was also in a transitional period and wouldn't be around for very much longer. So that was quite the accomplishment for Rick Mast. He would not get a DNF. He would come out and finish this race. He finished 41st, but he'd be running at the end of the checkered flag. So lap 56, the first yellow comes out as we see Terry Labonte scrape the wall. He blows out a tire. So we have 10 laps of caution there. I think it was Labonte would win Richmond in 98. Wouldn't quite have a great finish there. And I think Ray Dunlap, who was did an interview with him in the pits, made a reference to that Labonte wouldn't be having such a great night, and he's been known to do really well at Richmond. So the restart would stop on lap 66. Jeff Gordon would battle Jeffrey Bodine for second place. The power team Jeffrey Bodine was running for there. He would be up front quite a bit in this race. I think Benny Parsons also gave him quite a number of shout-outs throughout the evening. That Jeffrey Bodine, again, was one of those guys who achieved a lot of success in the 80s into the 90s, was really toward the tail end of his career here. So it was pretty neat to see him run up front for a bit with the leaders. Used pitch strategy to put himself into second. So Bodine would really challenge Gordon and Labonte, and even Stewart at one point for the lead. And but Stewart was able to withhold that and just kept driving away. But it was nice to see the Benny Parsons give a shout out there to Jeffrey Bodine. So lap 104 to 109, 6 laps of caution. Darrell Waltrip and Kyle Petty would tangle. Waltrip one lap down, and Kyle Petty was there trying to get back onto the lead lap. He would eventually do that. So that issue would play out for teams throughout the race. Tire wear, and you saw that a lot in this event, where drivers just would run into some issues with tire wear, and we'd see a lot of big names behind the wall before this was all said and done. I think Robert Presley was going through some issues at this time during the race. They didn't really talk much about it. I think they just made a reference to he was behind the wall at this time. So 140 laps, Stewart at 148. Stewart continued to just roll off the laps, continued to dominate the race. Gordon, Martin, Labonte, and Bodine were the front runners at 140 laps into this event. And at lap 169, we would see the caution come out as Chad Little would scrape the wall himself. Looked extremely frustrated, and I think Benny was this is the golden era of NASCAR telecast. Benny Parsons was A+ in this. You sit back, you listen to this commentary. Benny Parson brought it that night. He was A+. He's just, man, miss these guys, man. They were just incredible on the mic. So he comments about Chad Little being frustrated. It was a back end of the year for him, and poor Chad, poor John Deere car. That was a great paint scheme. That paint scheme looked pretty cool at Darlington too, with Ricky Stenhouse behind the wheel of that car. So there's a lot of pit stops under caution. Jeff Gordon would take the lead for 18 laps from 171 to 188. Stewart would fall back to third, Martin to second. So this is where Stewart was, I think, would say he had a really good car the whole night, but I think this is where Stewart was kind of not laying all his cards on the table there. So lap 189, Stewart would retake the lead, and a graphic would come out, again, comparing Stewart to Gordon here, just going to in-depth analysis of how much these guys were similar for their background. They both came from open wheel division to, again, they were painting a picture for the audience at home that Tony Stewart's the next Jeff Gordon. And they looked at the graphic here. So Gordon's 93 rookie year, he was 9th in the points. Stewart was 5th in the points at this time. He'd be 4th by the time the night finished. Top 10s, he had 10. Gordon, as Stewart had 15. And the average finish was 16.4 for Gordon. Stewart 10.4. So actually, statistically, Stewart was having a better rookie season. He wouldn't wind up to have a better career than Gordon. Well, he had, like I said, Gordon's career ran longer. Well, yeah, I guess it did run longer. I think Gordon had a few years on Stewart, but still 2 Hall of Famers. One's in the Hall of Fame. Tony's a future Hall of Famer. Similar career path and similar numbers in their rookie seasons. So Ned points out also that I alluded to in the opening of this program that he should have won the Loudon race in New Hampshire a few weeks back. He ran out of fuel, and he was just quite the... he was just catching momentum then in the summer. As I said, he would have moderate success as the season would open up. In the spring and into the summer months, he started to really find his footing and was building momentum. And the should have won the Loudon race, I guess, back in '99 in July. And he would lead through 602 laps, more than any driver in 1999. So he was just bringing them down that year. He was just clicking off the laps. And Jeff Gordon would retake the lead on lap 214 for a total of 25 laps until lap 212 when Ward Burton would spin around on the front stretch. And poor Ward Burton, he had some issues with Mark Martin earlier in the race, and I believe that he was coming off of a disappointing year. But as you know, in a couple of years, Ward Burton would go on to win some pretty big races. That's another guy I think that doesn't get quite the credit he deserves, and he's put together tough. He was in the shadow of Jeff Burton his whole career, his brother, but Ward was a tremendous driver. So the restart is at lap 219 after that caution is cleaned up. Gordon leads again. We have Martin out in second, Bobby Labonte in third, Stewart in fourth, Jeff Burton in fifth, and Ricky Rudd would get out of the car. As we mentioned, he had been battling some issues with food poisoning on the weekend. Dick Trickle qualified the car. Dick would step into the car here and finish out the night, relieving Ricky Rudd as he would get some relief in the back. Bobby Labonte takes the lead on lap 239 for only 4 laps. And then on lap 242, we would see Ron Hornaday and Mike Wallace spin. So this is the 5th caution of the evening. And I think at one point, because of the car was so similar in color, that even in orange car, Benny Parsons had thought that Tony Stewart had gone around, that he had some trouble on the track, but it turned out to be Ron Hornaday driving for Felix Sabates in a car that was an orange paint scheme. And on lap 234, Gordon takes the lead. Stewart is back to 5th. And on lap 257, Stewart would take the lead for good. And he would check out, as we all know. He would win this race and say, adios, amigos. Catch me if you can. So the closing laps of this race, the commentators discussed drivers' changes for 2000, and they covered much of the items in the news at the time that I was covering prior to this broadcast started, there was mention of Johnny Benson Jr., Ken Schrader driving the 36, Jerry Nadeau going to Hendrick in the 25. So I think the drivers were teeing up, I guess, the picture for 2000 and some of the driver changes, and Ricky Rudd's would come up about his team. And another thing I want to say here, it's just so minimal because we'll talk about it here in a minute. I'll talk about it actually at the again. It just is over like Rover in this race. But lap 304, the final caution comes out as Jimmy Spencer would get collected. Wreckage, I think Dale Jr. turned him around unintentionally. And I think a graphic appeared that in the last 12 races or 13 races, I can't quite remember. But I remember something that Jimmy Spencer had collected the most points of any driver since, I think, July or whatever that graphic was. But that was pretty impressive considering, again, Travis Carter, another team owner who had a car in NASCAR for a number of years, seemed to be fading away as the new millennium was on its way. So Gordon would lose the transmission shortly after. He would wind up finishing 40th after a really strong race. Ran up there with Tony. And this is where we go back to head scratching and just how there's a lot of comparisons between wrestling and NASCAR a lot. And the fans in pro wrestling and NASCAR are fairly similar. We have villains, we have heels. He's a heel, goddamn. And baby faces. So at the time, Jeff Gordon, even though, he had a great paint scheme, the Rainbow Warriors, and was over like Rover with a lot of fans, to some fans, he was a heel. And the crowd erupts when he has issues on pit road. And I think the announce team, who really have to remain unbiased, tried to, silence the crowd noise, tried to just ignore the fact that the crowd erupted as Gordon was going behind to the garage area with issues. And I knew he would not come back out and finish this race. So everyone loved to hate on Gordon, and Gordon was the original heel, was he not? Now Jimmy Johnson, years later, his protege would fall victim to the same kind of treatment from the fan base, where they despise him. They just completely are uninterested in what he's doing on the track. They don't want him to do well. And ironically enough, now that Johnson is just limping and doesn't look like the Johnson of old, he's sort of Superman lost his cape. They're crying for Johnson. They want him to win. And just like in Gordon and some of his lean years of his career, oh, Jeff Gordon isn't winning. What's going on with number 24? Do you remember just 7-8 years prior to that, you were upset the guy was winning too much? So I guess you never satisfy anybody. It's only human to never be satisfied. These drivers go through so much pain and anguish from fans who just cannot seem to understand that this is a sport, this is a competition. Disliking and hating on a dude is just pretty childish shit. But anyhow, we'll move on. So the crowd erupted, and a graphic comes up on the screen that Gordon was having sort of a off year in 99, although he was still fairly consistent and had a great accounting for himself. A graphic comes up on the screen of finishes 30th or worse. So in 95, he had 4, 96, 3, 98, 2, and 99, he had 6. So obviously this graphic is trying to tell us that, yeah, Gordon is not being Gordon here, and he's having finishes. He's suffering from lackluster finishes that are really diminishing his championship hopes in 1999. And as we'll see in the standings, as you look at the final standings in 99, he was nowhere near a championship that year. So everybody has an off year. So that graphic comes up just as Gordon's limping around the track, looking for salvation. He goes into the garage, has an interview. I believe it's with Ray Dunlap, and he asks him something along the lines of, do you think you can fix the car to get back out there? There's 40 laps left, and Jeff Gordon says something to the effect of, no, I don't think there's gonna be enough time to get out there, and it's just a shame, that we couldn't finish this race. We had a strong finish, blah 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 blah. The typical interviews these guys give. We had a great car, but we're not going to focus too much on that. So only one more finish. He'd finish outside the top 30 during that year. That'd be 38th in the season finale at Atlanta, as he'd be working with crew chief Brian Weitzel, and they went on quite the hot streak when they got paired up together. And the last time that Pontiac was 1-2 in a race was Rusty Wallace and Kyle Petty at North Wilkesboro. That came up on the screen. That was in April of '93, as Bobby Labonte and Tony Stewart finished 1-2. The first Joe Gibbs Racing, first 1-2 of Joe Gibbs' career in NASCAR, and Bobby Labonte had a great night. And late in the laps, there was a tangle up between Todd Bodine and Steve Grissom. That's another name, Steve Grissom. I know we're not going to talk incredibly a lot about Mr. Grissom in our program, but the '93 national champion, it's a guy we don't talk about very often either. Could never quite find his footing in Cup either, unfortunately. And this is the bit of the comedy. Benny Parsons, I think Benny needed himself some State Fair corn dogs that evening. The sponsor for Todd Bodine is State Fair corn dogs in this race, and they had an onboard camera, which was very popular at the time. The onboards were extremely popular at that time. And man, is State Fair corn dogs over like we're over in this race? Benny Parson, the State Fair corn dogs Pontiac driven by Todd Bodine. I swear to you, I've seen more of that graphic, more exposure for that sponsor than any other car in this race other than Home Depot, who led pretty much the whole entire race. With the race winner Tony Stewart, man, like State Fair corn dogs. I just put it in my Google machine when I was doing the research for this. This shit's still around, so I don't know. You got to get me a State Fair corn dog here, but Benny Parsons really gave those guys a lot of cheap plugs that night. So State Fair corn dogs, you had Benny Parsons was one of your number one fans. So, wow, this I don't know. Stuff like that tickles me. I don't know why it does, but Martin would ensure that his championship would pretty much ensure that his championship hopes were completely up in smoke, as with 31 to go, he would lose the car for the night. It would go away on him. Mark Martin would have some issues with his engine, and that pretty much would seal his fate in the title officially. And so I'm going to give you a rundown. This is for fun. This is the end of our program. This race is at its conclusion. Tony celebrates in the winner's circle, and he thanks Joe Gibbs and takes a big swig of Coca-Cola. And he's there to thank everyone. He thanks the Allison family, as he said that it's alluded to. He's the first rookie driver to win since '87 when Davey did it, and it was a class act. Tony was on his way to big things then, and then he'd morph into somewhat of a heel later on in his career. But let's just do a quick rundown for this event. So Stewart would win the race. You have Bobby Labonte and the runner-up. Dale Jarrett in third. He would get a post-race interview, and Dr. Jerry Punch would tell him his magic number he needs to clinch the championship in 1999. Sterling Marlin in the Coors car was in fourth. Kenny Irwin. And we didn't talk about Kenny Irwin a lot. Kenny Irwin did appear a lot in the graphics in this race, and he was running hard, nose to tail with Dale Earnhardt there for top five through most of the night. He finished fifth, and he had a great accounting for himself that evening. So good for Kenny Irwin. Bobby Hamilton, also, Benny Parsons gave a shout out to him quite a bit through the night with Morgan McClure. He had some flashes of brilliance in that race and was in the top half for a little bit. Ted Musgrave, the last car on the lead lap, he would finish in eighth. That would be his final top 10 finish of his career, as I alluded to. John Andretti in ninth. Dale Jr., one lap down, but his first career top 10. And the Budweiser car for DEI, the famous number 8. Mike Skinner, the Pulsar, would come home in 11th. Kenny Wallace in 12th. Jeff Burton would fade back in the end after having a pretty good car for most of the night in 13th. Rusty Wallace, Mr. Richmond, in 14th. Kyle Petty driving the Hot Wheel car in 15th. Steve Park in 16th. Elliott Sadler in 17th. Jerry Nadeau in 18th. That famous State Fair Corn Dogs Pontiac of Todd Bodine in 19th. Joe Nemechek in 20th. Ken Schrader was 21st. Johnny Benson Jr. would finish 22nd. Jeffrey Bodine would end up with a 24th place finish. Mike Wallace would be in 24th. Jeremy Mayfield would overcome some of the issues he had early in the race and finish in 25th. Kevin LePage driving for Jack Roush in 26th. Ricky Rudd in 27th, but Dick Trickle would finish out the car for Red. Wally Dullenbach in 28th. Ron Hornaday in 29th. Steve Grissom in 30th. Brett Bodine was 31st. Darrell Waltrip 32nd. David Green 33rd. Ward Burton in 34th. As we've talked about, Mark Martin would lose an engine and spoil his evening, relegating him to a 35th place finish. Bill Elliott in 36th. Jimmy Spencer in 37th. Michael Waltrip in 38th. Robert Presley 39th. Transmission issues would cause Jeff Gordon to finish 40th. And maintaining his streak of no DNFs at this time was Rick Mast in 41st. Chad Little in 42nd. And rounding out the 43 car field was Terry Labonte. And we had some drivers not make this race. Jack Sprague in the 45 car. Dave Marcus, good old Dave Marcus. That's another one of my all-time. I'm a huge Dave Marcus mark, but he would make the race. Hut Strickland in the 58 car. Stanton Barrett driving for Jeannie Dunleavy would not make it, and Tom Baldwin and the number 91 for Joe Falk would all fail to qualify. So that's gonna put a bow on this episode. This is the checkered flag, if you will, for the Exide Batteries 400. Thank you for coming along in the way back with me, and we survived. We got through it, and I'm coming at you again with another episode this week where we're going to talk about our weekly program. We're going to discuss the fallout from Indy, and we're going to set up the playoff picture for you. I think I'm going to critique who I think is going to have a phenomenal playoff, who I think is going to come out of nowhere and shock you, and I think those who are going to disappoint you. And we're also going to look at what's next for some of the drivers who weren't fortunate enough to qualify for the playoffs this year. Where do they go from here? How can they restructure and bounce back and make 2019 their year to make the playoffs? And we'll also cover some news items that are current for the week of September the 10th to the 14th. And we'll have that broadcast coming for you this coming Thursday on September the 13th. So that'll be episode 2 of Super Fantastic Above Average Racing Spectacular. So again, I want to thank you kindly for coming back with me to 1999 and looking at Tony Stewart's first ever career win in Cup. And until next time, I just want to tell everyone to love what you love, and just to keep falling in love with the things that you love and the people you love over and over again. It's the greatest feeling in the world. Until next time, I will see you.